Picture this, a room full of family and friends, champagne flowing, congratulatory speeches being prepared, and then the shock of seeing your husband walk in with his young secretary on his arm, introducing her as his +1 to your own anniversary party. But what happened next would change everything, and trust me, you won't see this coming. Margaret Sullivan had spent 3 weeks planning every detail of their 25th wedding anniversary party. At 52, she maintained an elegant composure that came from years of being a corporate executive's wife. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, her navy blue cocktail dress impeccably tailored, and her smile practiced from decades of social events. She moved through their Connecticut mansion's grand ballroom with the grace of someone who had hosted countless charity galas and business dinners. The mahogany floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and white roses filled every corner of the Kio room. Margaret had personally selected the catering menu, chosen the jazz quartet, and even arranged the seating chart to ensure maximum comfort for their 60 guests. She had worked with their longtime event coordinator, Patricia Williams, a woman in her 40s who had become more than just a vendor over the years. "Mrs. Sullivan, everything looks absolutely perfect," Patricia said, adjusting a centerpiece of white orchids. 25 years is quite an achievement these days. "Thank you, Patricia. Richard should be here any moment." "He promised he'd leave the office early today," Margaret replied, glancing at her diamond watch. It was already 7:30, and guests were arriving. Richard Sullivan, at 55, commanded respect in Manhattan's financial district. His investment firm managed billions in assets, and his reputation for closing impossible deals had earned him a corner office on the 40th floor. He stood 6 feet tall with distinguished gray temples, wore custom-tailored suits from Savile Row, and drove a black Mercedes S-Class that gleamed like his polished persona. But Richard had secrets that his wife was only beginning to discover. His secretary, Jessica Martinez, 28 years old with long dark hair and an economics degree from NYU, had been working closely with him for the past 2 years. What started as late-night strategy sessions had evolved into something that would destroy everything Margaret had built. "Mr. Sullivan," Jessica had said earlier that day in his office, "are you sure about tonight? This feels wrong." "Jessica, we've discussed this. Margaret needs to understand that our marriage is over." "This is the cleanest way to do it," Richard replied, not looking up from his computer screen. Their guests began arriving promptly at 7. Margaret's sister, Linda Thompson, a retired teacher from Vermont, embraced her warmly. "Maggie, this place looks like a fairy tale. Where's that husband of yours?" "Running late from the office, as usual," Margaret laughed, but there was a tightness around her eyes. Dr. James Morrison, their family physician and longtime friend, approached with his wife, Sarah. "Margaret, you've outdone yourself, though I have to say, you look a bit tired. Everything all right?" "Just the usual stress of hosting," she replied, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. The jazz quartet began playing "The Way You Look Tonight" as more guests filled the room. Margaret's college roommate, Ellen Price, now a successful real estate agent from California, pulled her aside. "Honey, I need to tell you something. I saw Richard last week in Manhattan, and he wasn't alone," Ellen whispered. Before Margaret could respond, the room fell silent. Richard had arrived, and on his arm was Jessica Martinez, stunning in a red cocktail dress that hugged her curves perfectly. The collective intake of breath from 60 guests was audible. "Good evening, everyone," Richard announced with the confidence of a man who owned the room. "I'd like you all to meet Jessica Martinez, my executive assistant, and tonight, my date, Margaret's." Champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor. The sound echoed through the silent ballroom like a gunshot. The silence stretched for what felt like eternity. Margaret's face had gone completely pale, her hands trembling as she stared at her husband of 25 years, standing with another woman at their anniversary celebration. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the jazz music that continued playing incongruously in the background. "What is this?" "Margaret, We need to talk." "Privately," Richard said, his tone businesslike, as if he were discussing a merger rather than the destruction of his marriage. But Jessica stepped forward, her voice clear and confident. "Actually, Richard, I think everyone should know. Mrs. Sullivan, your husband and I have been in a relationship for 2 years. He's been planning to leave you, and he thought tonight would be the perfect time to make it official." The room erupted. Linda Thompson stepped protectively in front of her sister, her teacher's authority commanding attention. "How dare you? This is Margaret's home, her celebration, her life you're destroying." Dr. Morrison moved toward Margaret, his medical instincts kicking in as he noticed her distress. "Margaret, sit down. You're in shock." But it was Ellen Price who voiced what everyone was thinking. "Richard, have you lost your goddamn mind? This is your anniversary party. These people came here to celebrate your marriage." Richard straightened. His tie, a gesture Margaret had seen thousands of times when he was about to deliver bad news to a client. "Ellen, I appreciate your concern, but this is between Margaret and me. We've been growing apart for years. Jessica and I have something real, something passionate." "Passionate?" Margaret finally found her voice, standing despite Dr. Morrison's attempts to keep her seated. "You want to talk about passion? Let me tell you about passion, Richard. Passion is supporting your husband through 3 business failures before he found success. Passion is sitting by your hospital bed for 6 weeks when you had that heart attack 5 years ago. Passion is hosting your clients, managing your household, and raising your children while you built your empire." The guests murmured their agreement, but Jessica wasn't finished. "Mrs. Sullivan, I understand you're upset, but Richard has told me how unhappy he's been. How you've become more like roommates than lovers. How you never understood his ambitions or supported his dreams." Margaret's sister Linda stepped forward again, her voice shaking with rage. "You little homewrecker. My sister put Richard through business school. She sold her grandmother's jewelry to help him start his first company. She's been supporting his dreams since before you were born." Patricia Williams, the event coordinator, had been standing frozen near the catering station. Unsure whether to continue serving or evacuate, she approached Margaret quietly. "Mrs. Sullivan, would you like me to ask the guests to leave?" But Margaret raised her hand. "No, Patricia. These people came here to celebrate something, and they deserve to see how it ends." Richard's business partner, Michael Chen, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s, had been watching the scene unfold from near the bar. He approached Richard with obvious discomfort. "Rich, maybe this isn't the time or place for this conversation. These people respect you, respect your family." "Michael, I appreciate your concern, but my personal life is my own business," Richard replied curtly. Meanwhile, Margaret's 23-year-old daughter Emily had arrived late, still in her hospital scrubs from her nursing shift. She walked into the ballroom just as Jessica was explaining her relationship with Richard. "Dad, what the hell is going on here?" Emily demanded, her voice carrying across the room. Richard's expression softened slightly at seeing his daughter. "Emily, sweetheart, I wanted to tell you and your brother separately. Your mother and I are getting divorced. Jessica and I are going to be married." Emily's face went through a range of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally, fury. "Are you insane? Mom planned this party for weeks. She's been excited about it for months. And you bring your mistress to humiliate her in front of everyone who loves her?" The guests began murmuring among themselves. Margaret could hear fragments of conversations. Always seemed like such a solid couple. Poor Margaret. That young woman is shameless. Richard's lost his mind. Jessica, perhaps realizing the room had turned completely against her, tried a different approach. "I'm sorry this is painful for everyone, but love doesn't follow convenient schedules. Richard and I tried to deny our feelings, but we couldn't." Dr. Morrison's wife, Sarah, a therapist who had known the family for 15 years, couldn't remain silent. "Jessica, what you're describing isn't love. It's selfishness. Real love considers the impact of our actions on others, especially children and family. But the most devastating response came from Margaret's son David, 26, a lawyer who had just walked in with his pregnant wife Amy. He had heard enough from the hallway to understand the situation. "Dad, I'm ashamed to share your name," David said quietly, but his words carried across the silent room. "Mom spent 3 weeks planning this party. She's been talking about your 25th anniversary for a year. She bought a new dress, had her hair done, arranged for all your favorite foods, and this is how you repay her?" Amy, 5 months pregnant with Richard's first grandchild, was crying softly. "Mr. Sullivan, how could you do this to Mrs. Sullivan? She's been so excited about becoming a grandmother. She's already started knitting blankets for the baby." The weight of his children's disappointment seemed to affect Richard more than anything else. For the first time since he'd arrived, he looked uncomfortable. But Jessica squeezed his arm, reinforcing her presence. "Richard," Margaret said, her voice gaining strength, "if you want a divorce, we can discuss that privately, with lawyers, like civilized people. But bringing your mistress to our anniversary party, humiliating me in front of our friends and family, that's not just cruel, it's evil." The tension in the room was suffocating. The jazz quartet had stopped playing entirely, and the only sounds were hushed conversations and the occasional clink of glasses being set down on tables. Margaret stood in the center of her own ballroom, surrounded by the wreckage of her life, while her husband and his mistress displayed their affair like a trophy. "Evil is a strong word, Margaret," Richard said, loosening his tie slightly. "I'm trying to be honest here. Isn't that better than continuing a lie?" Ellen Price stepped forward, her real estate agent's instincts for reading people in full force. "Honest? Richard, if you wanted to be honest, you would have had this conversation with Margaret privately, months ago. This isn't honesty. This is cruelty." Jessica, perhaps feeling the overwhelming hostility from the room, tried to defend their actions. "We didn't plan for this to happen. Sometimes love just finds you when you least expect it." Margaret's daughter Emily, still in her hospital scrubs, laughed bitterly. "Love, you're 28 and he's 55. What exactly do you love about him? His receding hairline or his bank account?" The brutal honesty of Emily's question hung in the air. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one disagreed with her assessment. David, the lawyer's son, had been studying Jessica with professional scrutiny. "Ms. Martinez, how long have you been employed by my father's firm?" 2 years, Jessica answered, suddenly wary of where this was going. "And in those 2 years, have you received any promotions, salary increases, or special assignments that other assistants didn't receive?" David continued, his courtroom voice emerging. Richard stepped between his son and Jessica. "David, that's enough. My business decisions are not up for debate here." "Actually, Dad, they are. Because if you've been using company resources to conduct an affair, if you've been giving preferential treatment to your mistress, that's not just a moral failing, it could be illegal." Michael Chen, Richard's business partner, had been growing increasingly uncomfortable as he realized the potential implications. Their firm managed pension funds and retirement accounts for thousands of people. Any whiff of scandal could destroy their reputation and cost them millions. "Richard, we need to discuss this situation privately. Tomorrow, first thing," Michael said firmly. But Margaret's attention had shifted to something else entirely. As she looked at Jessica more closely, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Jessica was wearing diamond earrings that looked remarkably familiar. "Jessica," Margaret said, her voice deadly quiet, "those are beautiful earrings." "Where did you get them?" Jessica's hand instinctively went to her ears. "They were a gift from Richard for my birthday last month." Margaret felt the room spin slightly. Those earrings had belonged to her mother, a family heirloom passed down through 3 generations. She had kept them in her jewelry box, planning to give them to Emily on her wedding day. Those earrings belong to my mother, Margaret whispered, then louder. Those are my mother's earrings. The room erupted again. Linda Thompson gasped audibly. Maggie, not Grandma's diamonds. Richard's face had gone pale. Margaret, I can explain. Explain. What? That you stole my family heirlooms to give to your mistress? That you took something that was meant for our daughter? Margaret's voice was rising, years of suppressed anger finally finding release. Ellen Price was furious. Richard, you didn't just cheat on your wife, you robbed her, you stole family treasures. But the revelation about the earrings had triggered something deeper in Margaret's memory. She began thinking about other missing items, other unexplained absences, other lies that suddenly made sense. Oh my God, she whispered, sinking into a nearby chair. The business trips to Chicago. There were no clients in Chicago, were there? Jessica looked increasingly uncomfortable as she realized how many secrets were being exposed. Richard, maybe we should go. No. Margaret stood up again, her voice stronger than it had been all evening. Don't you dare leave now. You wanted to make this public, so let's make it public. Tell everyone about the Chicago trips, Richard. Tell them about the client dinners that lasted until midnight. Tell them about the credit card bills for restaurants I never went to, hotels I never stayed in. Dr. Morrison approached Margaret again, concerned about her emotional state. Margaret, your blood pressure must be through the roof. You need to calm down. Calm down? Jim, my husband has been systematically lying to me for 2 years, stealing. From me, humiliating me, and you want me to calm down? Amy, David's pregnant wife, had been listening with growing horror. As someone who was just starting her own marriage, the betrayal felt personal. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm so sorry. This is awful. But it was Margaret's sister Linda who asked the question everyone was thinking. Richard, how much money have you spent on this affair? How much of Margaret's money from your joint accounts, have you used to wine and dine your mistress? Richard's silence was answer enough. Michael Chen was now openly worried. Richard, please tell me you haven't been using company funds for personal expenses. Of course not, Richard snapped, but his defensiveness suggested otherwise. Emily, still in her hospital scrubs, had been quietly observing Jessica throughout the confrontation. As a nurse, she was trained to notice details, and something about Jessica's behavior was bothering her. Ms. Martinez, Emily said, you seem very comfortable with all this, almost like you've been planning for this moment. Jessica's confidence wavered slightly. I don't know what you mean. I mean, most people would be mortified to be caught in an affair, especially at the wife's anniversary party. But you seem prepared, like you knew this was going to happen tonight. The observation hung in the air like a challenge. Margaret looked at Jessica with new eyes, seeing something calculating in her expression that she had missed before. Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your story. Richard was growing impatient with the interrogation. Enough. Yes, I've been having an affair. Yes, I want a divorce. Yes, I should have handled this differently, but it's done now. Margaret, you'll be well taken care of in the divorce. The house, half of everything. Generous alimony, Margaret laughed, a sound completely devoid of humor. Generous alimony? Richard, I helped build your business. I supported you through every failure, every success, every crisis. I don't want your charity, I want what I earned. The evening that had started as a celebration had become a public dissection of a marriage, a family, and a man's character. But the worst was yet to come. The confrontation had been building for nearly an hour, and Margaret could feel her strength beginning to waver. The initial shock had given way to a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that comes from having your entire life revealed as a lie. She looked around the ballroom at the faces of friends and family who had come to celebrate her marriage, only to witness its destruction. You know what the worst part is, Richard? Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly through the silent room. It's not even the affair. It's not Jessica. It's that you made me complicit in my own humiliation. You let me plan this party, knowing you were going to destroy it. You watched me spend weeks getting excited about celebrating our marriage, knowing it was already over. Richard shifted uncomfortably, some of his earlier confidence beginning to crack.
Margaret, I didn't plan for it to happen this way.
Bullshit! Emily exploded, startling everyone with her sudden vehemence. Dad, you didn't accidentally bring your mistress to Mom's anniversary party. You didn't accidentally give her grandma's earrings. You didn't accidentally let Mom plan. This whole thing while knowing you were going to blow up her life in front of everyone she cares about. Jessica, perhaps sensing that the room's hostility was becoming dangerous, tried to take control of the situation. Mrs. Sullivan, I understand you're hurt, but Richard and I are in love. Real love. The kind of love that changes everything. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. After 25 years of marriage, 2 children, countless sacrifices, and building a life together, this young woman was dismissing it all as inferior to their 2-year affair. Margaret's sister, Linda, couldn't contain herself any longer. You arrogant little bitch. You have no idea what real love is. Real love is staying up all night when your husband has food poisoning. Real love is refinancing your house to save his business. Real love is holding his hand while doctors tell you he might not survive surgery. The reference to Richard's heart attack 5 years earlier caused him to wince.
Everyone in the room remembered those terrifying weeks when Margaret barely left the hospital, sleeping in chairs, coordinating with doctors, managing his business while he recovered. Dr. Morrison nodded grimly. I remember those days, Richard.
Margaret was like a woman possessed, researching every treatment option, interviewing specialists, making sure you had the best care possible. She aged 10 years in those 6 weeks. And where was your true love then? Emily asked Jessica sarcastically. Oh wait, you were probably still in college, weren't you? The age difference, which had been lurking under the surface all evening, was now front and center. Jessica was closer in age to Richard's children than to Richard himself. But it was Margaret's son David who delivered the most devastating observation. Dad, do you realize what you've done here tonight? You've just shown everyone, your friends, your business partners, your family, exactly who you really are. You're a man who lies to his wife for 2 years, steals her family heirlooms, and then publicly humiliates her at her own party. Michael Chen had been getting increasingly agitated as the implications for their business became clear. Richard, do you understand how this looks? Our clients trust us with their life savings, their children's college funds, their retirement, security. What happens when word gets out that one of the partners is a man who betrays the person closest to him? The business implications hadn't occurred to Richard, and his face showed his growing concern. Michael, my personal life has nothing to do with our business. Are you kidding? Michael laughed bitterly. Richard, we manage money for teachers, nurses, firefighters, people who work their asses off and trust us to be honest with their money. How do I explain to them that my business partner can't even be honest with his own wife? Patricia Williams, the event coordinator, approached Margaret quietly. Mrs. Sullivan, should I start cleaning up? The staff doesn't know what to do. But Margaret wasn't ready to end the evening. Something about Jessica's behavior continued to bother her, and Emily's observation about her seeming prepared had struck a nerve. Jessica, Margaret said, studying the young woman carefully. You said you tried to deny your feelings for Richard, that you didn't plan for this to happen. But you're wearing a red dress to another woman's anniversary party. You knew exactly what you were doing tonight, didn't you? Jessica's composure finally began to crack. Richard asked me to come. I just wore what I thought was appropriate. Appropriate? Ellen Price laughed harshly. Honey, I've been to 1,000 social events, and that dress is many things, but appropriate for someone else's anniversary party isn't one of them. Amy, David's pregnant wife, had been quietly observing throughout the evening. As the youngest married woman in the room, she felt compelled to speak. Mrs. Sullivan, I've been married for 2 years, and I can't imagine. If David did this to me, especially while I was pregnant, I don't know how you're even standing right now. The comment about pregnancy seemed to trigger something in Margaret's memory. Jessica, how long did you say you've been working for Richard? 2 years, Jessica replied, but her voice was less confident than before. And when exactly did your relationship begin? About 18 months ago, Jessica stammered. Margaret's daughter Emily, with her medical training, was picking up on something in Jessica's demeanor. Ms. Martinez, you seem nervous. Is there something else you need to tell us? But it was Margaret who connected the dots first. The timeline, Jessica's confidence, her apparent preparation for this moment. It all pointed to something more calculated than a simple affair. Oh my God, Margaret whispered, her face going pale. This wasn't an accident at all, was it, Jessica? You planned this entire thing. What would you do in this situation? Tell us in the comments below. But then something incredible happened that would change everything Margaret thought she knew about her situation. As the room hung in stunned silence, waiting for Jessica to respond to Margaret's accusation about planning the entire affair, the ballroom doors opened quietly. A distinguished man in his 60s, wearing an expensive charcoal suit, entered the room. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. Margaret's face lit up with genuine surprise and relief. "Robert, oh my God, what are you doing here?" Robert Sterling, Margaret's older brother and a renowned investigative journalist who had won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, approached his sister with a grim expression. "Hello, Maggie. I'm sorry I'm late, but I've been doing some research that I thought you should know about before you make any important decisions tonight." Richard's face had gone completely white. He knew Robert Sterling by reputation. The man was famous for exposing corruption in high places, and his investigative work had brought down senators, CEOs, and foreign ministers. "Robert," Richard said carefully, "this is a private family matter." "Actually, Richard, I don't think it is," Robert replied, pulling a manila envelope from his jacket. "You see, when Maggie told me about the problems in your marriage a few months ago, I decided to do a little digging. Old habits die hard." Margaret looked confused. "Robert, what are you talking about? I never told you about problems in my marriage." "No, you didn't. But your friend Ellen did." Robert nodded toward Ellen Price, who was trying to look innocent. "Ellen called me 3 weeks ago. She was worried about you, said you seemed different lately, distant. She thought something was wrong, but didn't know what." Ellen stepped forward sheepishly. "Maggie, I'm sorry I went behind your back, but I could see you weren't yourself. You've been making excuses for Richard's behavior, covering for his absences. I was worried about you." David and Emily exchanged glances, realizing that other people had noticed changes in their mother that they had missed. Robert opened the envelope and pulled out several photographs and documents. "What I found was very interesting indeed. Jessica Martinez, would you like to tell everyone about your previous employment?" Jessica's face had gone completely pale, and she looked like she might faint. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Really?" "Because according to my research, before you worked for Richard's firm, you worked for Henderson & Associates, a private investigation company that specializes in corporate espionage and, shall we say, honey trap operations." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Margaret sank into a chair, trying to process this new information. "What's a honey trap operation?" Amy asked innocently. Robert's expression was grim. "It's when attractive operatives seduce targets to gather information, blackmail them, or manipulate them into making poor decisions that benefit the operative's real employer." Michael Chen stepped forward, his face showing growing alarm. "Robert, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that Jessica Martinez was hired to seduce Richard Sullivan, gather information about his business practices and client relationships, and potentially gain access to confidential financial information." Richard was shaking his head vigorously. "That's insane. Jessica loves me. We're going to be married." But Robert wasn't finished. He pulled out another document. "Jessica, would you like to explain this bank account in the Cayman Islands? The one that's been receiving monthly deposits of $50,000 for the past 18 months? Jessica looked like a trapped animal, her eyes darting between Richard and the doors, as if calculating her chances of escape. Ellen Price was putting the pieces together. "Oh my God, Maggie, she's been paid to destroy your marriage." But Margaret was still struggling to understand. "Robert, who would do this? Who would want to destroy Richard's business or our marriage?" Robert smiled grimly. "That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? But I have some theories. Richard, do you remember a client named Harrison Industries, the pension fund you managed about 3 years ago?" Richard's face showed recognition and growing fear. "Harrison Industries. We had some investment losses, but that was market volatility, nothing illegal." "Really?" "Because my investigation suggests that you moved their pension funds into high-risk investments without proper authorization, and when those investments failed, you used funds from other accounts to cover the losses temporarily." Michael Chen was backing away from Richard as if he were radioactive. "Richard, please tell me that's not true. Please tell me you didn't engage in unauthorized fund transfers." The room was spinning with revelations. Margaret felt like she was watching someone else's life unfold, unable to grasp that her husband might be both an adulterer and a criminal. Can you guess what happens next? Drop your predictions below. But Robert Sterling wasn't done with his revelations. The most interesting part is that Harrison Industries is owned by a larger corporation, Sterling Financial Group. No relation to me, by the way. And Sterling Financial Group has been looking for evidence of financial misconduct to use in a lawsuit against Richard's firm. David, the lawyer, was following the implications. So you're saying Jessica was hired by a company that wants to sue Dad's firm, and her job was to get close to him and gather evidence of financial crimes? That's exactly what I'm saying, Robert confirmed. And based on the evidence I've found, she's been very successful. Bank records, client files, internal communications. She's had access to everything. Jessica finally found her voice, but it was shaky and desperate. "Richard, I do love you. Yes, I was hired initially to gather information, but my feelings for you are real." Margaret laughed, a sound filled with bitter irony. "So let me understand this. My husband is a thief who's been embezzling client funds. His mistress is a professional con artist who was paid to seduce him and gather evidence of his crimes. And I've been the fool in the middle, planning anniversary parties while both of you destroyed my life for your own purposes." The weight of multiple betrayals, her husband's infidelity and criminal activity, combined with Jessica's manipulation, was almost too much to bear. But somehow, knowing that Jessica's affection had been fake, made the affair feel less personal, less like a referendum on Margaret's worth as a wife. Dr. Morrison approached Margaret with professional concern. "Margaret, you need to sit down. This is too much shock for anyone to handle." But Margaret was finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "Actually, Jim, for the first time tonight, I feel like I can breathe. At least now I know what I'm dealing with." The revelation that Jessica had been a paid operative rather than Richard's true love had fundamentally changed the dynamic in the room. Margaret was no longer the humiliated wife replaced by a younger woman. She was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy that went far beyond simple adultery. Robert Sterling continued sharing his investigation results. "Maggie, I've been working with a team of forensic accountants for the past 2 weeks. The evidence of financial misconduct is overwhelming. Richard has been using client funds as his personal bank account for over 3 years. Michael Chen was frantically trying to calculate the implications for their business. "Richard, how much money are we talking about? How much have you stolen?" Richard slumped into a chair, the fight finally going out of him as he realized the scope of his exposure. It started small, just temporary loans to cover cash flow issues. "I always intended to pay it back." "How much?"
David demanded, his lawyer instincts taking over. About $12 million, Richard whispered. The number hit the room like a physical force. $12 million in stolen pension, funds, retirement savings, and college tuition money belonging to working families who trusted Richard with their futures. Ellen Price was doing quick calculations. Jesus Christ, Richard. That's not embezzlement. That's a federal crime. You're looking at 20 years in prison. But Margaret was focused on something else entirely. Jessica, what was your end game here? You gather evidence, help them sue. Richard's firm, and then what? You disappear with your $50,000 a month? Jessica was clearly panicking, realizing that her cover had been blown and her employers would not be happy about the public exposure. Mrs. Sullivan, I never wanted to hurt you personally. This was just a job. Just a job? Emily was incredulous. You destroyed my mother's marriage, broke up our family, humiliated her in front of everyone she loves, and it was just a job? Amy, David's pregnant wife, was crying softly. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm so sorry. This is horrible. But Margaret was surprising everyone, including herself, with her composure. The shock of discovering that the affair had been fake was somehow liberating. Her marriage hadn't failed because she wasn't good enough. It had been sabotaged by professionals. Robert pulled out more documents. Maggie, there's more. Jessica has been recording conversations with Richard, photographing documents, copying computer files. Everything Richard told her in confidence has been passed along to Sterling Financial Group's legal team. Patricia. Williams, still uncertain about her role in the evening's chaos, approached Margaret. Mrs. Sullivan, what would you like me to do about the party? Should we end the evening? Margaret looked around the room at her friends and family, all of whom had witnessed the complete destruction of everything she thought she knew about her life. But instead of embarrassment, she felt something unexpected. Relief. Actually, Patricia, I think we should continue the party. But let's change what we're celebrating. Linda Thompson looked at her sister with concern. Maggie, what do you mean? Margaret stood up, smoothing her navy blue dress, and walked to the center of the room. Her voice was clear and strong as she addressed the gathered friends and family. 25. Years ago, I married a man I thought I knew. Tonight, I discovered that man never existed. The Richard I married was honest, faithful, and principled. The Richard standing in this room is a criminal and a liar. So instead of celebrating 25 years of marriage, let's celebrate the end of 25 years of deception. The room was completely silent as Margaret continued. Robert, what do we need to do to make sure Richard faces justice for his crimes? Robert smiled with professional satisfaction. I've already contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division. They'll want to interview you tomorrow, and they'll need access to all financial records. Jessica, I hope you've been keeping detailed records of your activities, because you're going to need them for your cooperation agreement. Jessica looked confused. Cooperation agreement? David stepped forward, his legal training evident. Ms. Martinez, you're an accessory to federal crimes. Your best option is to cooperate fully with federal prosecutors in exchange for immunity or reduced charges. Michael Chen was already on his phone, presumably calling his lawyers. The business, partnership he had built with Richard over 15 years, was about to become a liability that could destroy his reputation and financial security. But Margaret was thinking about something else entirely. Robert, you said Sterling Financial Group is behind this. What happens to them? They hired a woman to seduce my husband and destroy my marriage as part of a business dispute. That's where things get interesting, Robert replied, with a predatory smile. While Richard's financial crimes are real and serious, Sterling Financial Group's methods are also illegal. Honey trap operations, industrial espionage, conspiracy, they've opened themselves up to significant legal liability. Ellen Price was beginning to understand the implications. So Margaret could sue them for damages, for destroying her marriage, and humiliating her? She could do much more than that, Robert said.
She could be a very wealthy woman when this is all over. Margaret looked at her brother with growing understanding. You've been planning this, haven't you? This whole evening? Robert nodded. Once I discovered what was really happening, I knew we needed to expose everything publicly. Jessica and her employers were counting on secrecy and shame to keep their activities hidden. By forcing everything into the open tonight, we've documented their crimes in front of 60 witnesses. Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your story. The anniversary party that had begun as a celebration of marriage was transforming into something entirely different. The first shot fired in what would become a legal war that would ultimately restore Margaret's faith in justice. The next 6 months would prove to be the most transformative period of Margaret Sullivan's life. What started as the worst night of her marriage became the beginning of the most satisfying revenge she could have never imagined. Robert Sterling's investigation had been more thorough than anyone realized. Within 48 hours of the anniversary party, FBI agents executed search warrants on Richard's office, home, and personal accounts. They found evidence of financial crimes dating back 5 years, involving not just the $12 million Richard had admitted to, but an additional $18 million in unauthorized transfers, fraudulent investments, and outright theft. The media coverage was relentless. Investment executives stole $30 million from pension funds, dominated financial news for weeks. Richard's photograph appeared on the front pages of newspapers, and his name became synonymous with white-collar crime. But the story that really captured public attention was the honey trap operation. Jessica Martinez's role as a paid seductress, hired to destroy a marriage for corporate espionage purposes, fascinated the media and the public. The secretary who wasn't became a best-selling exposé that Robert Sterling wrote for a major magazine. Margaret discovered that she wasn't just a victim, she was also partially an owner of Richard's firm. Community property laws meant that half of everything Richard owned belonged to her, including his partnership interest in the investment company. When the FBI seized Richard's assets, they also had to account for Margaret's legitimate ownership rights. Michael Chen, desperate to save what remained of their business, offered to buy out Richard's partnership interest at fair market value, approximately $40 million, which meant Margaret was entitled to $20 million. But Margaret had a different idea. Michael, she said during a meeting in her lawyer's office 3 months after the anniversary party, I don't want to sell Richard's partnership interest. I want to keep it. Michael looked panicked. Margaret, with all due respect, you don't have any experience managing investment funds. Margaret smiled, and it wasn't entirely pleasant. You're right, I don't. But I know someone who does. My brother Robert has been investigating financial crimes for 20 years. He understands this business better than most people who work in it, and he's looking for a new challenge. The implications hit Michael immediately. Margaret wasn't just claiming her financial rights, she was positioning herself to take over Richard's role in the firm. With Robert as her advisor, she would control half of a business worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But Margaret's revenge against Sterling Financial Group was even more satisfying. The company that had hired Jessica to destroy her marriage found themselves facing multiple federal investigations for industrial espionage, conspiracy, and racketeering charges. More importantly, Margaret's civil lawsuit against Sterling Financial Group became a landmark case. Her legal team, led by her son David, who had taken a leave of absence from his corporate law firm to represent his mother, argued that the company had deliberately inflicted emotional distress, invaded privacy, and destroyed a marriage for corporate gain. Your Honor, David argued during opening statements, this case is about more than money. It's about a corporation that decided that destroying a family was an acceptable cost of doing business. They hired a professional to seduce a married man, not out of love or passion, but as a calculated business strategy. They turned intimacy into a weapon and marriage into a battlefield. The jury was sympathetic to Margaret's case, and the evidence was overwhelming. Sterling Financial Group had documented their entire operation in emails, financial records, and progress reports. Jessica Martinez, facing federal charges and abandoned by her former employers, cooperated fully with prosecutors and civil attorneys. The civil trial lasted 6 weeks and became a media sensation. Margaret attended every day, sitting in the front row, wearing elegant business suits and maintaining perfect composure, while lawyers presented evidence of how her life had been systematically destroyed for corporate profit. The most dramatic moment came when Jessica Martinez testified about her assignment. "I was told to make Richard Sullivan fall in love with me, to gain his complete trust, and to document any evidence of financial irregularities. The fact that he was married was considered an advantage because it would make him more vulnerable to manipulation." "And did you succeed in making him fall in love with you?" David asked during cross-examination. Jessica's voice was barely audible. "Yes. He wanted to leave his wife for me. He gave me jewelry, took me on expensive trips, talked about our future together. He had no idea that I was reporting everything to my handlers." "How did that make you feel, knowing you were destroying a family for money?" Jessica broke down crying on the witness stand. "I told myself it was just a job, that people get divorced. All the time anyway. But seeing Mrs. Sullivan that night, seeing her face when she realized her marriage was over, I knew I had become something terrible." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They awarded Margaret $57 million in compensatory and punitive damages from Sterling Financial Group. The company filed for bankruptcy within a month. But perhaps the most satisfying element of Margaret's revenge was what happened to Richard himself. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison for embezzlement, wire fraud, and money laundering. At 55 years old, he would be in his mid-70s before he was eligible for parole. The prison where Richard was housed was a medium-security facility in Pennsylvania that housed white-collar criminals alongside more dangerous offenders. Margaret received regular reports about his adjustment to prison life through victim services representatives. "He's having a difficult time," the counselor told Margaret during one of their quarterly check-ins. "He keeps insisting that he was a victim of manipulation, that his secretary tricked him into making poor decisions. The other inmates don't have much sympathy for someone who stole pension funds from teachers and firefighters." Margaret found she had mixed feelings about Richard's situation. The anger and betrayal were still there, but they had been joined by something more complex, a sense of justice being served, and a recognition that Richard's downfall had been largely self-inflicted. Jessica Martinez received a sentence of 5 years probation in exchange for her cooperation with prosecutors. She was required to perform 1,000 hours of community service and pay restitution to Margaret of $200,000, essentially everything she had earned from her honey trap operation. But Margaret wasn't finished with her transformation. Using her newfound wealth and her partnership in the investment firm, she established the Margaret Sullivan Foundation, dedicated to helping families recover from financial fraud. The foundation provided legal assistance, counseling, and financial support to victims of white-collar crime. "I learned that I was much stronger than I ever realized," Margaret told a reporter during an interview about her foundation. "When your husband of 25 years betrays you in the most public, humiliating way possible, you discover resources you didn't know you had." The anniversary party that had been intended to destroy Margaret's life had instead become the catalyst for the most empowering period she had ever experienced. She was wealthier, more independent, and more respected than she had ever been during her marriage. Emily and David were incredibly proud of their mother's transformation. Mom went from being a corporate wife who managed Dad's social calendar to being a businesswoman who manages hundreds of millions of dollars in investments, Emily told friends. She's become the person she was always capable of being, but never had the chance to discover while she was supporting Dad's career. Margaret's sister Linda moved to Connecticut to help manage the foundation and provide emotional support during the transition. "Maggie was always the smartest person in our family," Linda said. She just spent 25 years letting Richard take credit for her intelligence. 2 years after the anniversary party, Margaret received an unexpected letter in prison mail. It was from Richard attempting to apologize and asking for forgiveness. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am for everything I put you through. I was weak and stupid and selfish, and I destroyed the best thing in my life. I think about that anniversary party every day and wish I could take it all back." Margaret read the letter once, then put it in her fireplace and watched it burn. She had moved far beyond needing Richard's apologies or explanations. Her life was fuller and more purposeful than it had ever been during their marriage. On the 3rd anniversary of what she now called Liberation Night, instead of her anniversary party, Margaret hosted a celebration at the same venue where her marriage had been destroyed. But this time, she was celebrating her independence, her success, and her survival. The guest list included many of the same people who had witnessed her humiliation 3 years earlier. But now, they were celebrating her triumph. Ellen Price flew in from California. Dr. Morrison and his wife attended with pride, and Margaret's children brought their own families to honor their mother's transformation.
3 years ago, I thought my life was ending, Margaret told the gathered friends and family. I had defined myself entirely through my relationship with Richard, and when that relationship was revealed to be a lie, I thought I had nothing
left. But I discovered that I had everything I needed inside myself. I just needed to lose everything else to find it. Robert Sterling, who had retired from journalism to help manage Margaret's business interests, raised his glass in tribute. "To my sister Margaret, who proved that sometimes the best revenge is living an extraordinary life." Margaret smiled as she looked around the room at the faces of people who loved and respected her for who she was, not for her relationship to someone else. The anniversary party that was meant to destroy her had instead freed her to become the person she was always meant to be. And that's how justice was served. Margaret Sullivan's story proves that sometimes the worst day of your life can become the first day of your best life. What started as the ultimate betrayal became the catalyst for transformation, empowerment, and the sweetest possible revenge. Sometimes karma takes time, but it never misses its target. Richard Sullivan thought he was trading up when he chose Jessica Martinez over his wife of 25 years. Instead, he traded a loving marriage for a federal prison sentence, financial ruin, and the loss of everything he had spent decades building. Jessica thought she was running a simple con game for easy money, but she ended up exposed, prosecuted, and forever associated with one of the most notorious honey trap operations in corporate espionage history. But Margaret? She discovered that she was stronger, smarter, and more capable than she had ever imagined. She went from being a corporate wife, managing social calendars, to being a businesswoman, managing hundreds of millions in investments. She transformed from victim to victor, from humiliated spouse to celebrated survivor. The Margaret Sullivan Foundation has helped over 3,000 families recover from financial fraud, providing legal assistance, counseling, and financial support to victims of white-collar crime. Margaret's story became a case study in business schools about the dangers of corporate espionage and the importance of ethical business practices. Her children, Emily and David, learned that their mother was a force of nature who had simply been channeling her power into supporting someone else's dreams. Amy and David named their daughter Margaret, in honor of the grandmother who showed them that it's never too late to discover your own strength. Even the venue where Margaret's marriage was destroyed has become part of her legend. The Country Club now hosts an annual fundraiser for the Margaret Sullivan Foundation, raising money to help other victims of financial crime rebuild their lives. If you love stories where justice wins, smash that subscribe button. Margaret Sullivan's transformation from humiliated wife to empowered businesswoman proves that every villain gets what they deserve, and every victim has the potential to become a victor. Binge watch more revenge stories in our Sweet Justice playlist. From cheating spouses to corrupt bosses, we have hours of stories about people who got exactly what was coming to them. Share this with someone who believes in karma. Margaret's story shows that sometimes the worst betrayal can lead to the best revenge, not through cruelty or violence, but through success, independence, and living an extraordinary life. Don't miss our next story. It's even more shocking than this one. We'll explore another case where someone thought they could destroy another person's life, only to discover that they had picked the wrong victim, proof that every villain gets what they deserve. Richard Sullivan is spending the next 20 years thinking about the night he brought his secretary to his anniversary party and lost everything. Jessica Martinez learned that honey trap operations come with real consequences when the targets fight back. And Margaret Sullivan proved that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to be destroyed by someone else's cruelty. Subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and redemption, because in a world where bad people sometimes seem to win, these stories remind us that justice might be delayed, but it's never denied. And sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys really do finish first.